Music is sound, but what is a musical sound? This might sound like an easy question to answer, but in some ways it's quite difficult. Lots of noises and voiceovers and things like that are included in music. Are they extra to the music? Are they supplemental? Or are they part of the music themselves? Clapping and stomping are obviously parts of music. So instead of answering this larger question, what is musical sound, let's look at what pitched sounds are, which are a major element of music. I can pluck a string on this cello, and the same tone continues to play over a long duration. Now I can slide my finger up and instead of one tone, I have infinitely many tones. Now, it's not only pitched tones that are musical, there are also intervals. An interval is when two notes have a different frequency, are played together at the same time. There are many intervals that musicians use. Technically, there are an infinite number of possible intervals. Some intervals are more common than others, some are more consonant than others, some are more dissonant. Any melodic succession of notes can be analyzed into the intervals that make it up. Let's look at some of the most popular and frequently used intervals in music. It's common practice to understand these in relation to consonance and dissonance, but as we'll see throughout this course, those are very amorphous and debatable, partially subjective appraisals. What interval is more and less consonant? Now, it's not completely made up, it's not completely conventional, it's not purely a construct, although it is strongly influenced by habit and culture and things like that. Let's think first about the octave. An octave is a very strange and unique interval in music because an octave gives us the appearance of having the same note but higher or lower. So if we start with this note, we can move up an octave or down an octave, and it sounds like we have the same note being played at each of those intervals. Now, if I start here, I have this octave, but if I start on another note, then it has its own octave above it and below it. And that goes for every note on our 12-tone scale. The octave is really the most basic interval of all. It's what binds a scale together. So a scale is usually a series of notes that falls between an octave. In the West, we usually only use one octave to define a scale. So if we have these two notes, between those notes, we put other notes. And each of those has an octave that corresponds to it. So an octave is basically the most similar sound you can possibly make in an interval. So it is a different sound. It's higher or it's lower. But it is not very different in the way these two notes are different. Or these two. Or those notes sound very different from one another. But these two notes, or these two, sound incredibly similar. They're almost the same note. Almost the same note. So the octave is a very strange and unique interval. All other musical intervals are different, are in fact a different note. The octave is the only one that is sort of the same note. Now, the next most consonant note is the fifth. And it's called the fifth because it's 5 notes up in the scale, in the classic scales that have been used in the West since the Renaissance. 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's called the fifth only because it's the 5th degree of the scale. And this gets very confusing because the ratio that it represents is 3 to 2. It's not 1/5 or anything like that. The fifth does not refer to a fraction or a ratio. It only refers to the scale degree. So that can get very confusing in the conversations about harmony, which we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. So the fifth is generally considered to be the second most consonant interval next to the octave. So the octave is almost the exact same note, but it's not quite. The fifth also goes together very well. It's a very stable interval, very powerful. And it's used in all types of music, basically, across the world, except certain atonal musics of the 21st century, 20th and 21st century. There's something very peaceful and balanced about the fifth. It's comforting, stable. Doesn't feel like anything needs to happen when you hear this interval. When you hear a more dissonant interval, you want resolution, right? So the fifth is used in a lot of cadences, and a cadence is when the music, the melody, or the chords moves from a dissonance to a consonance, to something tense and uneasy and anxious, to something stable and peaceful and calming. Now, generally, the next interval considered to be the most consonant would be the fourth. The fifth and the fourth. It's only one whole step down. So 2 notes down, because each note is a half step, is considered a half step in the Western scale. So it's very close to the fifth, but it's different. It sounds unique. Not quite as stable, a bit more rough around the edges, a bit more like it wants to resolve to the fifth. Some kind of resolution when we move from the more dissonant to the more consonant. But I think that the fourth is actually slightly more dissonant than the major sixth. Major sixth is very balanced, very soft. Doesn't really feel like it needs to go anywhere. Feels content. The fourth feels more like it's pulling towards that resolution. And these are things we're going to be thinking about and talking about throughout the semester. Why do these sounds pull towards other sounds? Why do we feel rest at some intervals and tense at other intervals? One more interval to consider, another one of the major consonants, is the third, the major third, as it's called. Another very consonant interval. Usually used along with the fifth in what is called a triad. Again, this is very stable. It feels like we don't have to go anywhere. Like now, if I add tension, release. So within these basic intervals, we have feelings, and we have almost environments come about already. Here we're in an environment of safety and security and stability. Here, suspense, unexpected tension, resolution, stability. Musical intervals are often closely associated with certain feelings, and this goes really across time and across cultures to some degree. The major triad is associated with a feeling of serenity, happiness, contentment. The minor triad has a melancholic, sad, tension, mourning to it. And the minor sixth is even more passionate, even more sad. We're going to be looking time and again at how different feelings and emotions are conveyed using different intervals, different sounds, different chords, different instruments, different voicings. There are so many parameters that a musician can use to slightly change the mood and the effective value of a musical piece. One of these most basic elements of all are these intervals. Some of the most basic intervals called just intervals. These intervals are based on simple fractions, oftentimes what's called a superparticular ratio. A superparticular ratio is when the two numbers involved are 1 apart from each other. So 3 to 2, 4 to 3, 5 to 4, things like that. And those correspond to the octave, 2 to 1. It's literally double the value of the first one. The fifth, which is 3 to 2. The fourth, which is 4 to 3. The major third, which is 5 to 4. The minor third, which is 6 to 4. And some other ones like the whole tone, which is 9 to 8. With those basic fractions, those basic intervals, you can create many, basically innumerable scales. And one of the most popular, famous ones is called the diatonic. The diatonic scales, which are very similar to what we call the major and minor scale. Those are the diatonic scales. And with those, you can convey many emotions, many meanings, many feelings, moods, attitudes, things of that nature. This scale and these intervals are based on the intervals of the harmonic series, which we've been looking at in this module. The harmonic series is a bunch of intervals of diminishing length. The first interval is the octave. The second one, slightly smaller, is the fifth. The next one is a fourth, which takes you up to the next octave, and then a third, and then a minor third, which takes you to the fifth, and then these much smaller intervals, the first one being 7 to 6, and then 8 to 7, which takes you to the next octave, and then again diminishing little by little. You have a 9 to 8, 10 to 9, and so on, getting smaller and smaller and less musically useful in some sense. And those intervals, this is all very mathematical, right? But it's actually physical. And when I play this note, you have the main note, which is ba, right? But if you listen closely, this note is also audible, the octave up. And this note, right? And this note is fairly audible there. Listen carefully. So those notes are actually included in the notes. So this note includes within it all of those notes are there. If you listen very closely, it's there as well. It's not something we generally notice or take stock of, but all notes on musical instruments involve those harmonics as overtones, those ratios as overtones of the fundamental note. And it's also the basis of our scales and the intervals we use to build those scales.